Okay, so I'll just give you very quickly, in the second session, I'll come to the philosophical text, but very quickly to give you a sample of other kinds of texts. As I'm sure as you have seen right from school, if you look at a chemistry text, it's very different. There are a lot of pictures in texts there. You draw molecules in particular ways. So in a sense, scientific texts, in trying to talk about the world, know that there's a very important lesson there, which is that language can never capture the richness of the world that it wants to describe. And textual writing is a constant attempt to catch as much of the richness of the world as you can through language. So a problem is that all talking about texts and talking about the world is through language. We have no other choice. When we describe something, we are using language to describe what there is. And because of the limitations of language, all that we can do is try and create a text which can as closely mimic the world as much as possible. And we may always struggle with it. We don't know whether it will work, it may not work. And that's why when science post Galileo, Einstein, etc. shift into mathematical writing, their argument is mathematics captures the truth of the language far greater than that of natural language. And there are reasons for that, but that is a different, if there any interest, if any of you are interested in that questions, we can come to that. But let me give you another example. Okay, this is again a typical example. We won't go through this. I just want to show you something which is happening in a text like this, which is different from philosophical text. One is that, typically even research papers and definitely advanced textbooks use symbols and diagrams to a great extent. There is a lot of visualization within a text. Very rarely you will find philosophical texts which do visualization like this. There are no cartoons and figures and diagrams and images in these texts. They're just text heavy. They're just full of, if you're looking at English or German or Sanskrit, they just start from one and keep going down to the other. So what is very interesting about this is when we read a text, so this is the crucial point. When we read a text, what are we doing? We are reading a sentence in a text, and then you have to connect it to the picture that you see in the text and the way in which the picture is marked in various ways through all these kinds of symbols. So somehow you keep making a constant visualization of the world which is reproduced in the text. In fact, some might argue, and it's actually a very interesting thing to think about, that mathematical writing itself is a visualization of language. So, like example, just like you draw a cartoon. So the most standard example which you learn from school physics is this, the pendulum example, right? So you have a pendulum and then it is oscillating. And the school textbook will show pendulum as a line with a bob at the bottom. That's it. That's all you need to do to understand how a pendulum moves. So what you have done is you have reduced the world, the real complexity of a pendulum, into one line with one circle at the end of it. Mathematical writing, the symbolic writing, does that to language. Just like you took a pendulum, or for example, you take a huge sun and replace it with a point and say that is the center of the sun. You take a word like force, F-O-R-C-E, some combination. Force is also a drawing, by the way. I hope you recognize. Language is also, words are also kind of a drawing which you read in a different way. You take the whole word force and reduce it to one symbol, F. It's just like taking a big sun and reducing it to a point. Just taking a pendulum and reducing it to the diagram. And that's this idea of reduction is extremely important in scientific texts.
I believe Feynman did that with his Feynman diagrams of QED.
In a very, very profound way. And it's quite fascinating that for such advanced quantum electrodynamics which Feynman is writing about, it is completely reduced to simple diagrams. And the diagrams are really, if you look at it, it's really a comic book picture of the world. It's like two object particles will come meet, so they'll be shown like two prime, and then they annihilate, so there's a wave-like thing, and then after some time they break apart and go away as two particles. And you do a lot of stuff around it. So how is this diagrammatic imagination so important to scientific texts? What does this diagrammatic imagination do in the scientific text? Not there in many other texts. Closest it comes in literature is comic texts. And people don't give comic that much weightage like great literary texts, but comics are actually doing something very profound about the nature of reading a text. Something very interesting happening. So this is just one example of that. Here is a mathematical text, because again, just to show you, if you go through the text carefully, you'll see there are some various things which are actually differ quite strongly in this. But so, for example, in this text, what you're doing is you're also manipulating words and concepts in very interesting ways. So you have to take my word for it, because you have to come here and we can show you line by line on it. But what you're actually doing is you're saying something and you're doing something with words. And that's very common to all empirical scientific texts. Anything which is talking about the world, in trying to match the word and language, it does something to the idea of language. But if you look at the mathematical text, it's actually quite interesting, because the biggest paradox about mathematics is this. What is mathematics really about? What is it talking about? If I look at the previous one, I realize when Newton is talking about the earth going around the sun, I know there is an object called the sun, there's an object called earth, and the earth is going around, and I'm trying to describe it. Or if a biologist is describing the flora and fauna here, and the biologist can write how the trees look and can draw various stuff, or how butterfly, all these kinds of work which biologists can do. But what is the object of discourse of mathematics? What is it really talking about? Just like a biologist, or a biologist I'm using loosely, would say that the tree is green in color, the trunk is of this particular diameter, etc. Some very minimal description. The mathematician is also doing the same kind of description. But a description of what? The mathematician is saying there is a number, let's say 2, which is a prime number, which is an even number. Just like saying this tree is green and it has got this kind of curvature, etc. It is talking about properties of things, mathematical objects, mathematical things. The difference is the mathematical things don't exist in the world. Or at least we don't know if they exist in the world. So mathematics as a discourse is constantly, a very important part of mathematical text is the constant attempt to create newer and newer objects of mathematical. A large number of them are actually about creating new things to talk about. So it's almost like, Harry Potter kind of stuff. Fantasy creatures. You have one fantasy creature, okay, then another one you put some more things on it, it's another fantasy creature. Then you have another fantasy creature with more properties. And you just write a story about all these fantasy creatures. And each one of the mathematical objects that you choose will be different kinds of creatures which you create, which you then do something with. And that's the interesting point about mathematics. Because in the whole historical, philosophical tradition, the constant question has always been, why is mathematics not another fiction? Why is it not like another story, like Harry Potter story, except instead of having all these funny looking creatures, you have funny looking mathematical objects. Matrices, functions, groups, sets, categories, all kinds of, some kind of objects. They have their own very funny properties. Why is mathematics then not just another very creative, very imaginative, very literary imaginative set of things which we create to talk about? Because unless you tell me that numbers, categories, groups, sets, etc. are part of the natural world, which we look at the natural world and describe how it is. I can look at the chair and describe some properties of the chair. Mathematics is doing all the description of those properties, except those things have been imagined by the mathematician. But if that was the case, then why should mathematics be meaningful to us? You should be teaching it in BA. Actually mathematics was taught in BA for long. They used to give BA honors in mathematics in India. Now some scientists have hijacked mathematics. But the point is that, there are different ways to make sense of, as a discourse, as a text, it's a very imaginative, creative description of what certain kinds of their objects are doing. The reason it becomes so important is then the physicists and the scientists try and show how these mathematical things are actually present in the world. The conversion of mathematics into a science is possible only because those creatures you have dreamt of in mathematics can be mapped to natural world phenomena. Very good instances, people have, this has been much more in popular literature. For example, the Fibonacci sequences, very interesting sequence of numbers, group structures of very specific kind of group structures are all present. So people will show you, take the sunflower and you look at the patterns of the flower, or look at the patterns on a seashell. All of them correspond to certain mathematical structures. And therefore the argument is, when you talk of mathematics, it may look like you have created all these funny things in your mind, but actually they exist in the world in a very interesting way. That's, in fact, Frege, one of very, very important logician and philosopher in the German tradition, makes a point which many others have been saying later, that the only, and which Wittgenstein also, another great philosopher of language, says, the only reason mathematics is meaningful, is important, is only because it is applied in the description of the real world. It is used in the description of the real world. If it was not for that, mathematics is, in their words, like a chess game. It's very complex, it's very interesting. Chess game, you really, you have theorems in chess, you have various kinds of, inexhaustible possibilities, and you need to be so-called very intelligent to do that. Like they say about mathematics. But, it's just a chess game. It's not going to get rid of poverty or change development just because you're good at chess. But the difference between chess and mathematics is, mathematics becomes essential to the description of the real world. Or at least that is the claim by scientists. Without mathematics, you cannot have physics. At least physics. Biologists do not accept that claim. They have a lot of struggle with it, dispute it. But then, the reductive picture in science is biology can be reduced to chemistry, and chemistry can be reduced to physics, and physics can be reduced to mathematics. Therefore, the most important text for science is actually mathematics. But this, I'm just showing this because this is, so suppose somebody is reading this, you'll have to really ask, what should I have to be able to read a text like this? Because, pardon me?
Lots of patience.
Lots of patience, of course, and you will have to, again, it looks like it uses English terms. There are a lot of English terms in it. But, so for example, a category C is a class of elements called mappings for certain pairs of which a product is defined subject to the axioms. That definition is almost fully proper names again. Just certain specific technical terms which are all put next to each other. And unless you know the meaning of those technical terms, you can't do anything much. But there is something else which it does here which is useful to keep in mind. What it does is, you can use those definitions, but you can do something with those definitions. I first define something, but I then manipulate and operate on those words. That's a very important, extremely important thing of generally scientific text. So it's not just a description. So it's almost like saying tree is green in English. Then what do I do with those words I've used? How do I manipulate and operate upon those words? That idea, which really distinguishes mathematical writing and scientific writing from English writing, is something we have to think about. It may sound a bit complicated. I'll come back to it and see if we can make better sense of it. I'll give you one example now of a philosophical text which tries to mimic the scientific text. Mimic in a very different sense. This is a very famous text by Spinoza called Ethics. And what is interesting about Spinoza's, what Spinoza is doing, and this is part, as I was telling you, that in Western philosophical tradition, mathematics is the model for philosophy. That is, philosophical knowledge was sought to be like mathematical knowledge. And the thing about mathematical knowledge is sure, certainty, 2 + 2 is 4 for everybody, all those beliefs about that. So Spinoza And there's a very important connection to that, is that the study of philosophy begins the study of logic. Even now classical traditions begin the study of logic. And logic was supposed to be the best exemplar of mathematics. In fact, one of the most famous works on mathematics by Russell and Whitehead is to reduce arithmetic to logical principles. Every result of arithmetic, like 2 plus 2 equal to 4, can be reduced as a logical consequence. So it becomes a deductive logical system. So what Spinoza is trying to do Spinoza is a great philosopher, an extremely influential philosopher, who has had a great impact on modern philosophy. When he is trying to write his book on ethics, he tries to structure it like a logical schema. And even by writing, he will first begin by what he thought was an important part of scientific text. First, describe what you're talking about. First, define clearly, this is what I mean. And then you do something else. Okay, again, look at these are practices which you follow even in our writing today. So he'll come by saying, instead of using good as a very general term, and then people will be asking, what do you mean by good, what do you mean by good? He begins by making the statements, the definitions. By good, I mean that which we certainly know to be useful to us. By evil, I mean that which we certainly regard, etc. And then his whole book is structured like deductive conclusions. So you reconstruct the whole text as if it is a deductive. So deductive, just very quickly for those of you who may have forgotten this from your school, is that you have one premise, one sentence, another sentence. Deduction is combining the two. What can you conclude? So you say all men are mortal. The famous example is Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That is the conclusion coming from two other sentences or two or more sentences before that. And mathematics is actually deductive because you can say 1 plus 1 equal to 2 in terms of the series of derivations. And that is the whole aim of showing how mathematics is reducible to things. So this is one example of Spinoza's text. Here I am only pointing out the larger structure of the text. Looks like this, because see, you have to ask a very simple question, which literary studies people will know better, so they can tell us. For example, the novel. The novel is not always a genre which was available. A novel becomes part of what today we think everybody has been writing novels, but what is it, 200 years old? Possibly 18th century, yeah. In 18th century is when you have the idea of a novel which is developed. There's nothing called a novel before that. So if you go look for searching for novels in Indian traditions, for example, you won't find a novel. There may be kavyas, there may be other kinds of writings, but it's not novel as a genre of writing. So different texts have different genres, different styles. And philosophical writing was a very deep influence on the type of texts which are produced in literary texts. And this is just to give you an example of how the larger text follows. This is a macroscopic structure it is following. But I want to show you actually the microscopic structure of philosophical text to show you how the problem of writing philosophy is, some problem of reading philosophy. I'll just expand this, but first I'll tell you a little bit about this. One of the things philosophers often do, and it happens around us all the time, is that they are very exclusionary as a community. Their most favorite pastime is to say who is a philosopher and who is not a philosopher. Rather than, this is the biggest problem, because you ask any of our friends from literature, they say any of the literature persons who write philosophy or draw on philosophy, they say they are not philosophers. To the extent that one of the most famous French philosopher, or two famous ones, Foucault and Derrida, when Derrida was a very influential philosopher. He's actually a trained philosopher in that sense. He reads Aristotle, he misreads and rereads him in very interesting ways. But he had a great impact on many different disciplines. And when he was awarded Cambridge, I think, awarded him an honorary doctorate, the philosophers in Cambridge wrote a letter saying you cannot give him a doctorate in philosophy because he is not a philosopher. This is actually very interesting to me all the time, because that's why we often say, whenever I speak about various things, because I work on a different variety of fields, I never declare myself as a philosopher, because Somebody will say, no, you are not a philosopher, you are a philosopher, etc. So philosopher is a very contentious thing. Within philosophy, there are two groups. One is the analytical tradition and one is the continental tradition. And it's a very artificial grouping. And what a very important part of the distinction between analytical, and they are loggerheads. Actually, the origin of analytical and continental, they had very common origins, but they drifted apart. But they are, even today you will find abusive posts, not by students, but by very established authors. One of the famous examples is of Chomsky and Zizek. Zizek is one of these guys standing for this continental, and Chomsky is the most important linguist / philosopher of languages, I'm sure if you have heard. And Chomsky is very critical of this, these French writers who don't know what they say. They think they write whatever they want off the top of their head, and then you can't make any meaning of it. Actually, Professor M.N. Srinivas, who was here, one of the founding fathers of this institute, was a very famous sociologist, father of Indian sociology. When I first joined, I gave him some talks on postmodernism and all that at that time. So he used to always ask me, he'd say, how are the French obscurantists doing? He was a very good traditional empirical social scientist, anthropologist. He always referred to them as French obscurantists, because you can't make sense of what they are saying. That's a general thing, but a lot of people write about it. And this has led to a big fissure within philosophy. There is this continental tradition, which as Siddharth was just telling me, which is very true, which a lot of people often refer to them that way. They have science envy.
You mean the analytic tradition?
The analytic tradition. That is, they want to be scientists of some kind, but since they are not doing science, they try and write like scientists. So the closest you can do is we try and write like them, because you're not doing science. And they want to write philosophy like that. In fact, the analytical tradition begins with this idea that it begins with a very actually important point, that the German philosophers, particularly the famous triumvirate after Hegel, particularly Hegel, but of course leading up to people like Husserl and Heidegger, but particularly Hegel, these philosophers were writing very broad. These are called a systems philosophy. They are talking about some spirit, and you have to really read them to see what, you really have to struggle to read them to see what they are saying. Russell and others had a very simple argument. They said, what you are doing is you are just putting together words and creating big sentences which are actually meaningless, but which you think has meaning. And this is a big problem, because then our students are reading all those texts thinking they are saying something very profound, but basically they have strung together a large number of words. I mean, this is not just about Russell and co. Even today, I remember when I first joined NIAS, there were some people here who said, philosophy is just too verbose. Why are you guys going on talking all the time? You're not coming to the point. You're not saying something clearly. You're just saying something which is not clear to us, and it looks like very complicated. That's a very big problem of the kinds of writing. And I'll give you an example of continental philosophy to show that. This has become such a fissure that departments are broken on that. If you are a continental person, you will never be hired. For example, in the US, in philosophy departments, nobody could do a PhD on Derrida. It was in the English departments that they were doing Derrida and Foucault and others. In the philosophy departments, it all had to be this analytical philosophy. And what is analytical philosophy? In the sense of Russell and others, treat a philosophical problem like a scientific problem. And how does science treat a problem? By breaking it up into its smallest parts. Not trying to answer what is life, for example in biology, but answering what is DNA, what is the DNA of a particular species which under a particular condition. Very, very specific. And it is also related to a question of language. And this is the fundamental problem about texts. What is it? This comes from what is called a verificationist theory of meaning, which is any sentence has meaning because you can construct any sentence. The big problem of sentences like the infinite of the infinity under transcendental manipulation will give rise to something. I'm just making it up totally. It's not that difficult writing philosophy. So when you write that, it looks like you're saying something very profound, and this is the critique of the argument, but it is not, according to them. So the whole analytical tradition functions in a writing very differently. They also will not use the word I. They also do not show expressions of emotion. It's written like as if these are small science problems you're solving, except the problems are in philosophy, and you're solving a small problem in philosophy with some specific argument. So the notion of argument, which is always very important for scientific, philosophical texts, that you can say what you want, but you have to argue. This is the first lesson you teach in any philosophical class. You say, I always used to say this to my students, give me a good term paper saying the earth is flat, I don't mind. I have no stake in whether the earth is round or flat. But it's how you argue for the fact that the earth is flat and the earth is round. So philosophy invests a lot in making this set of arguments. And analytical tradition is particularly very clear on this particular point. So so for example, just to give you an example of how they are trying to do this science envy or pseudoscience at some level, but maybe it is not. See, I'll just read one line. This is, I know, big, but I won't. So this is Lewis's thing, is it? David Lewis. So let us read it quickly. Cat Tibbles is alone on the mat. Tibbles has hairs H1, H2 to H1000. Let C be Tibbles, including all these hairs. Let C1 be all of Tibbles except for H1. And similarly for C2 to C1000. Each of these C's is a cat. So instead of one cat on the mat Tibbles, we have at least 1001 cats, which is absurd. This is Geach's paradox of 1001 cats.
If we stopped at absurd, it would have worked.
It would have worked, is it?
Yeah.
Why? You don't like the sentence Geach's paradox?
Actually, the whole thing, if we stopped at absurd.
Oh, absurd and then not write the other stuff?
Self-reflexive recognition of his.
Yeah. Okay, like that. No, but this is a point. This is what is interesting about it. This is a typical standard practice of this philosophical textual writing. That is what the problem is posed, like you saw in the Spinozian thing, very clear definitions, no ambiguity. One of the big problems about using terms in philosophy is it's too ambiguous, anybody can interpret it in different way. So you restrict yourself very clearly to what you mean. It's a very important tradition, by the way, within the Sanskrit philosophical tradition too. It's called the delimiters. It's very similar to how mathematics also uses meaning for its terms. So, but more important than that restriction is the nature of argument. And a very classic nature of argument in analytical philosophical text. You know it's a philosophical text when you see an argument like this. This is an argument based on contradiction. It's a standard giveaway. Because you will say something like which is absurd is actually about some contradictory principles operating. So what the analytical philosophical textual tradition is to be able to show to you without confusing, without hiding behind vagueness of words and meaning, to tell you this is my problem, this is my solution, and you are now open. You don't need to. It will look like it's accessible to all of us when you read this. But there is an argumentative strategy which is very present, because then you see what he does, the standard thing, sets up the problem and then he says, explains it in great detail as an argument. Why should we think that each CN is a cat? Because CN would clearly be a cat where the hair H is plucked out, and we cannot reasonably suppose that plucking out a hair generates a cat, so CN must already have been a cat. And so on. He's already referring to some earlier philosophical tradition like this. But this gives you an inkling of what they are trying to do, which is reductive again. The text is about reducing, and the reduction is actually very interesting. Remember that when I say science does the job of reducing, what does it do? If you want to solve a science problem of the earth going around the sun, you take a complex sun which is so big, which has got color, temperature, etc., and reduce it to a point called S. You put a point and say, let S be the sun. Then you take earth, which is all complex in a million ways, and reduce it to a point called E. Then you make the E go around the S and draw a circle around it. Once you draw a circle, which is what Newton does in his Principia, once you draw a circle, you can then do mathematics on it. You can draw a tangent, you can draw a chord, you use geometrical results of how this circle can be split up, etc., etc. And this is what actually Newton does through these geometrical examples. So you have broken a complex problem into amenable solution. It is not that is the way the earth goes around the sun. Newton's argument would be that this is the only way we can answer the question, how does the earth go around the sun, by reducing it to simpler parts which are amenable, which I know how to deal with. So here too, you are asking, so there are 2 or 3 markers of why this is an analytical text. One, the nature of writing, the way it begins with very small sentences, and I'll give you a contrast, you will see how it is so different. It's almost like anybody can read it in principle. And in principle, if you know a little bit of training of thinking through arguing, you should be able to follow this stuff. It's not very difficult as far as language is concerned. And third point, which is an indicator of an analytical philosophy text, is a subject matter. What kind of questions does it deal with? What the subject matter is. As I told you, every discipline is defined by the objects of its discourse, what it talks about. Physics does not talk about what biology talks about, largely. The objects of discourse, those things which it talks about, are also very clear for the analytical tradition. So, what it talks about, how it talks about, and the way in which language is used to talk about it are the 3 markers of any text. And analytical philosophical tradition can be distinguished from others on exactly those grounds. Now, to appreciate this or not appreciate as much, we can see, I'll give you one example of a very influential philosopher in the continental tradition. A lot of people draw extensively upon him today. He's a French philosopher whom Professor Srinivas might also call as an obscurantis. But I want to use as an example to show what he is trying to do. So in one, I don't want to, when I'm showing these texts, my aim is to try and understand what they are doing and why they write texts in this manner. Because in order for us to be able to read and access these philosophical texts, we need to know the strategy of reading. Because remember that reading, we read in very different ways. The first lesson of reading is that there is no one type of reading that we do. We actually read different ways, and the best example I often use for this, a very powerful example, is a newspaper. The way you read the front page of the newspaper is not the way you read the sports page of the newspaper. When you read the sports page, you're looking to pull out information. When I read the first page, I'm trying to find out whatever is happening in the court's argument or the political domain, etc. So we read text very differently. Okay? So to say that, when the analytical philosophers say, what are these texts, you can't make sense of what it is, I want to point out a very important problem, why they write such texts like this. So let me just give the problem with Badiou is, Badiou for some reason is greatly stuck upon the null sets, which seems like a mathematical term, but what he does with it is what no mathematician will do. In fact, I don't know if people have heard of Sokol paradox, Alan Sokol's paradox. He is a physicist at NYU who wrote a paper on deconstructing quantum gravity or something like that. He wrote a paper, sent it to a very important journal in social humanities called Social Text. And it follows a style of social science writing. It's very highly footnoted, hundreds of references, intertext referencing, etc. And Social Text, which is supposed to be a very prestigious journal, published that article. Then Sokol wrote to them and came out in public saying this whole paper is a hoax. I just made it up. Nothing of what I say in this is not just true. He said it's actually nonsense. I don't even know what the words and sentences mean. I just strung together the biggest if you like, the jargons and the terms which others are using, and I just wrote it. And I've sent it, and you people are idiotic enough to publish it in a very highly reputed journal. Social Text refused to print his, this one, and then he published it elsewhere, his description. And then he wrote a book. Actually, there was in EPW, which for those of you who are not from Social Science, Economic and Political Weekly, is a leading social science journal in India, published a series on so-called hoax. You can go search in the net. I also wrote one critiquing him and his nature of reading in that text. So, they just talked about all over the world, and he and another physicist called Brickmore, a French Belgian, I think, they wrote another book called Fashionable Nonsense. And the book was just an example of all the philosophers, especially primarily the continental philosophers, who misuse scientific terms in their writing of whatever it is that they were writing. So these guys went on a massive attack saying these people are using terms which they don't understand, like topology, differential nature, all that stuff which supposedly is a copyright of mathematicians. Which interestingly, one of our counters was these words itself were taken up by mathematicians from an ordinary language and modified to suit their ends. Now these philosophers take the mathematical terms and modify it to suit their ends. That was the larger problem. But the problem was this. They said they write such stuff which are totally meaningless, but they confuse the reader by using mathematical terms. So somebody who is reading it will say the topology of the multiple of the infinite will think, oh, maybe it's profound. And all of continental philosophy is like that. And it's interesting, there are a lot of other cases which came up. People tried to write more such papers and get it published in leading humanities journals. Already humanities was discredited, it became more discredited in the eyes of the scientists. Badiou is one of their common targets. And Badiou uses null sets, because null sets are actually very important, very, very interesting. Empty set. Empty set is actually the foundation of all of mathematics. If you look at philosophy of mathematics, the null sets play a very important role. In fact, the only thing which people will accept as real in mathematics is null sets. You don't need numbers other than null sets to construct all of the edifice of arithmetic, for example. And that is earlier known with Peano's axiomatization and so on. But he does something with this. Let me just read one. The differential, we can forget the sets. But the what is always a multiple. No, that is also not really useful. This purely extensional character of the regime of the same and the other is inherent to the nature of set theory, being theory of the multiple without one, the multiple as multiple of multiples. I'm quite shocked that none of you are laughing as yet. Normally when you do this, there are people already laughing. But what I want to point out is the first instance, this also looks like one of the scientific texts. Why? Because it looks like you understand all the words in English. I don't even have too many technicals. There are many of them are common language terms, because except for the extensional character, the regime is, we all understand. It's actually the same meaning as a regime. Of the same and the other is inherent to the nature. So the being theory of the multiple without one, the multiple as multiple of multiples. Now, what should the reader have in order to be able to access this text? And that's, what I'm trying to say is, philosophical texts, the nature of philosophical texts, one, have to have objects of discourse, what they're talking about. Two, the nature of the argument of presentation of the discourse. And three, the use of language in a particular way. What I want to point out that even in a continental philosophical tradition like this, there is a great similarity to how mathematical texts are written. And I'll give you the example here. Just we can look at this sentence itself. And this sentence follows that. What possible source could there be for the existence of difference, if not that of a multiple lacking from a multiple? So it's a classic, I think, brilliantly captures the struggle of continental philosophy. What is it talking about? It's actually talking about the sameness and the other. How things are identical and different. So it's about identity and difference, if you were like, in a larger context. Why do we think some things are very similar? Why do we think some things are different to each other? So the philosophical question here is sameness and difference. which is a common philosophical trope. There are many people who have written on sameness and difference. It's a very simple, basic philosophical question because a classic instance is all of us are same as humans but different as individuals, for example. All our categorization of things, for a brilliant example, simpler example of the chairs. All these chairs are same as chair, but they're different as individuals, as independent, separate chairs. How to characterize the sameness within difference and the difference within sameness? Is this problem is actually captures the problem of philosophical writing. That is, it seems like a paradox. So, in analytical philosophy, as we saw, tries to use paradox and contradiction as an argument. Here, paradox is used as a style of thinking, not as an argument. I don't have to prove to you that there is a paradox between sameness and difference. I want to begin with it, not prove to you making an argument with it. Because, so the writing is very often, you will see this in continental philosophical writing, it will always be like, in the midst of plenty there is absence. Or in the middle of absence there is also full presence. These typical contradictory terms will come together, and the first time you read it, you find that really, this is another childish game. You need to have patience to actually struggle through it and ask what would they mean. So let me try very quickly to show why I struggled with this for 5 minutes is to give you a reason why they do this. So if you look at the regime of the same and the other, and he's pointing out that the same and the other question is fundamental to set theory. Set theory is, okay, at the very simplest instance, a set is a collection of different things. Okay, I can take chair, table, mic and make a set of that. It takes different things but puts them into one set. And he is invoking that image of the set theory to say the sameness and the other is actually captured by some nature of set theory. But what is that? Being theory of the multiple without one, the multiple is multiple of multiples. Okay, this is why philosophical texts are never concluded. Philosophical texts are always need commentary to make sense of what they write.
Yeah, that was my point. So once you have the commentary, then this becomes intelligible to some extent.
No, but we are already commentators. We may need commentary if I don't want to work through with this. But the act of commentating is my act of making meaning of this. And to do that, you need a principle. And this is a principle which philosopher Davidson refers in general about reading text. And this is the principle of charity. And the principle of charity states that I will take a text like this and assume it is seriously meaningful and not a joke like so-called paper, and I can make sense of what it is trying to say. If you don't have principle of charity, we will not read any text. In fact, so-called's problem is that because I can read so-called and say how meaningful he is. You can actually give explanation of how when people use mathematical terms it could mean this, etc., etc. It's not very difficult. So here, if you really look at it, we can say why this is meaningful, etc. or not. But when he is writing like this, what does he want the reader to do? Part of what he wants the reader to do is he wants us to solve part of the problem he does. And that's why I said it's a lot like mathematical texts. Because what is so special to mathematical texts, even textbooks? What is so special to it is that a text, they'll do some, let's say, quadratic equations. And at the end of the chapter, there is exercises. There is no meaningful mathematical text without exercises at the end of it. When you read poetry book, there's a chapter on poem. Nobody's giving, I don't know if people have started now, exercises, write a poem on the sky. One could do it. But the idea of exercise is very important because what it is saying is reading of mathematics is the doing of mathematics. You cannot read it, you can read all kinds of stuff, but unless you solve all those 100 problems, and this is the single reason for trauma for childhood around the world. But unless you solve all those 100 problems, you're not going to learn what mathematics is. Badio, especially in the content of philosophical tradition, is also telling us to be a philosopher is to not just read what I write, is to be able to recover, make meaning of what I write through work by you. Reading is not passive. Reading has to be actively active, in the sense it is meaningless at the first instance. I mean, even I'm reading it as what is it? Multiple of multiples. What can it mean? Yeah.
I was thinking, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether he was trying to make a generalization of how numbers are. I mean, there are primes and then there are multiples of primes.
Yeah.
And of course, any number can be represented as a multiple of primes, and you can rearrange them so that that thing that he has written on.
Yeah.
I mean, you could probably make some sense of that.
Yeah.
I don't know whether he's trying to say that there is that identity. I mean, this is the same as that.
Yeah.
And then there are these primes which are not these, or something like that.
So,
I mean, that's my principle of
sure.
working on it. Perhaps
Very true. And that's what is needed when you read a text. Because what you have done is give one commentary on this.
Right, yes.
Now, some of us can have other commentaries, can write something, but we already have one way of approaching what he could mean. But the principle what he is doing is, one can read it in other ways also.
Sure.
Multiple and multiples, but here he's obviously drawing, definitely it is involved with the kind of, but what he's trying to do is to make us, I think it's a very important part of all philosophical writing. It challenges the naive way by which we accept terms. Sameness and difference, what's a big deal? Sameness, difference, we are surrounded by sameness and difference. Like I said, chair, humans, trees, everything. And there is no idea of a concept itself has a sameness and difference. But how do you understand it? How is sameness within difference possible? Or how is difference within sameness possible?
So is he mathematicizing everything? Is he abstracting everything to some general principle? Is that
Okay, no. He is actually, this is from Being and Event. Yeah. So it's actually about the question of being, which is a very important philosophical thing. So there has been extensively people have written on the nature of being and so on, particularly in this tradition. And he is offering something else through using other metaphorical structures from mathematics. But I think even if you don't have all the earlier part, multiple as multiple of multiples or multiple without one, theory of the multiple without one, is actually an interesting idea to think about. And in that sense, philosophy, it's the task of, so when I asked what is the object of discourse of philosophy, what does philosophy talk about? One, there are a set of constant concepts like being, time, space, causality, etc. These are all standard subject matter, but part of the task of philosophy, particularly from this tradition, is the creation of new concepts which we have not thought of before. A constant creation of, just like mathematicians constantly create new objects which we haven't thought of before. So new mathematics is as much new objects which are created. Suddenly some groups, then cohomology groups, homology, homotopy, something they'll start. Then you do something with it. In the same way, creation, finding possibilities of new concepts which have not been articulated before. It's a very important task of philosophy. So it's in that sense a completely original driven kind of a conceptual thinking. And in that you can see theory of the multiple without one is a very interesting, I can see immediately we can write a lot on what is a multiple without one, which is, can you ever conceive of multiplicity without a notion of unity underlying it?
Being and nothingness.
Yeah, so that's why there's a tradition of something around this. It can be, being and nothingness has a very different vocabulary and tools behind it. But we can just start with asking, what is this? Is it just a cognitive thing that the multiple is always thought of with respect to unity, or is it something else, etc., etc. And that is really the task. Sorry, yeah.
So yeah, I fall into MS Srinivasa's school.
Yeah.
I call this fellow an obscurantist. But my point is that this seems to be written very much for, it's a he, right? So his peers. It's not written in order to be intelligible, I think is what the obscurantist argument
Yeah.
says. And this seems to be very much of that kind. You know, I mean, written in order to obscure rather than. So, I mean, there was this in the 80s.
Okay.
In America, there was this what do you call that board that used to say eschew obfuscation. Be clear.
Yeah.
You know, that sort of thing. This seems very much to choose to obfuscate rather than be
Okay.
clear.
So let us see if that, you know, I'll give one example to that.
So the question added to this is, who are these philosophers writing for?
Yeah.
Because I don't look at a science textbook and say it's not clear all these numbers and symbols. But as philosophers, it falls upon the philosopher to write to some other people, not their
That
own.
everybody should be able to.
Everybody
Okay.
should be able to read a philosophy text and make perfect sense of it. Whereas when a mathematician writes his text, it's okay if non-mathematicians don't understand.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point. Let me just come to that. Yeah. I'll come to that.
Yeah. So two things. One, you mentioned every mathematics book will have some exercises. But that is possible because now you also have a solution at the end, which is non-ambiguous, and not subjective.
Yeah.
And the other thing with mathematics is you have something like Euclid's element, which provides the base understanding upon which the rest of, at least most of it, is built. So is the argument that you need something like that for philosophy also?
Yeah.
Or is philosophy so different and it is so open to interpretation? Because the cartoon seems to suggest something else. You know, that Epictetus and the Dark 98 guys, right? That happened probably because the Dark 98 they did not have the, what do you say, Rosetta Stone or whatever to understand what philosophy was.
Okay. So, okay, I will take all these three, one more. Okay, I'll first finish these three and come to you.
Can I add something?
No, yeah, I just, yeah.
Does a philosopher, everybody has his own personal philosophy. So does a philosopher actually need an audience?
Okay, so I think this is, let me first work around this. I mean, so this point, be clear, is also related to this, which is that one, who is the philosopher writing for? As I said, in mathematicians, it's true that the number of people who actually follow mathematics is very, very small. There is this debate on citation, and people are saying, you know, the impact factor in citation, how many people cite a thing. There was a debate in current science, when a mathematician wrote, he said, a very well-known mathematician, well published, and he said, I write a paper in mathematics, there are two other people in the world who will read it. Probably one of them has reviewed it. Because the one who reviews, there are only two people you can send it to. And that guy who reviews, I'm using guy very as an open term here, would probably know who has written this, because there are 4 or 5 people, we know what the other person is writing, and we are only going to review it. How many people do you think are going to cite me? Nobody's going to be citing me, and you say, I want number of people to have high citations and all that. So how do you expect that for mathematics? You know, the question, that is one is the question of the specialization, the point I think to take from what Veera is saying is that we easily accept it in science and mathematics compared to philosophy. In a sense, we want it to be accessible. We are also saying a part of the accessibility is because of the language point. You have written it all in English, and if it is in English, why shouldn't I understand it? So we should remember that in all disciplines, including in the natural science and social science, the formations of the discipline is not just about methods and what they talk about. It is also about the way of writing. There are very good instances. I'll just take 1 second for it. It's a fascinating story of social sciences. When social sciences comes as a discipline, their biggest opponent is the literature department. Because both social science and literature people are writing about society. And the literary people said, why should we have social scientists doing something? We are anyway better writers. So sociology as a department in its origin had to overcome the literature people, because literature was at a higher prestige. Very, very good instances in, you will see this in Sorbonne, in France, Germany and England. But what happens is this, once they realize this, the sociologists are no longer just said, we are describing society scientifically, they said we'll also write like scientists, which the literature people are not doing. So at one stroke what they do is, you get a prestige for your discipline by also changing the way you talk about the discipline. So they become very quantitative, they start using technical terms, they write in ways which are not accessible to everybody, etc. And there's a very important strategy of writing which differentiates a discipline. So, in the case of mathematics, we would, if you read something like this, for example, multiple as multiple of multiples may be obscurantist, but this expression bra gamma gamma belonging to etc. is not necessarily obscurantist. It is not obscurantist because, let's say, as a mathematician, you know what it is. But what Badiou might say is, yes, this is not obscurantist because as a philosopher, I know what multiples of multiples is.
I think the onus people place in philosophers is because they talk about stuff that is much more common.
Exactly, correct.
So people don't want to be sort of.
No, and that's very valid. Correct. I accept that. I think it's very valid, and we need to take that on board. But the philosophers will also say we are talking about terms like being, okay, which you may not talk about in our day-to-day life. What is it to be? Except when you are 17 years old and depressed, we never ask about what is it to be, right? So for him, the point is, so some people make a distinction between academic philosophy and philosophy in the general sense, and some of these academic texts might be there. But in spite of all that, I still think there is a lesson from this, and that lesson is this: that the struggle, see this as a struggle, not as purposefully trying to mislead us. I mean, this is the charity principle again. I'm saying there are many. My point about many of our students who read this and start writing like this is just that you're just imitating something and which you don't have grasp of. You're not. That struggle is not what is there. You write a very complex sentence and think, oh, you're saying something profound, and that is really not the case. But the struggle. Let's assume Badiou is a serious person, and there's something. What is a struggle? I'll give you one example. A very good, very simple, very illustrative example of another philosopher whom people have written, who also has been tough particularly on his book Being and Time, but has also been a great teacher. So he's written very good books which are very readable, including a very famous book called What is Called Thinking. And this is the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. I'll give you just one example. Heidegger, when he was writing one of his texts, he recognizes some problem, which is he would write a term, let's say being, and scratch it off. Okay. But he retains the scratched word in the text. And he's now doing a new textual thing with us. He's making us read it differently. What is he saying? He's saying, I want to use the word being, but I realize it's not the correct word, but I don't have any other word. So I want you to read this sentence saying, let's say for example, being is permanent, full stop. Okay, and then he puts being scratches, or let's say being is permanent and scratches permanent, but keeps permanent there. So when you are reading it, you're reading being is permanent. Because you could have just said nothing, no? You could have said being is a full stop. He wants to retain permanent and also wants to say I'm cutting it out.
Convenient.
Not convenient. It's a struggle for language. And this is the fundamental point. We are not sure that the language we have can match the reality of the world. You have to create new words. So part of it is to create. He could create being is alpha, beta, zip, zap, something. Full stop. We won't know what it is. We'll go back to a dictionary to see what it is. The part of the struggle with these philosophers is, so for example, he does another thing. He uses a term, being in the world.
Think of something which doesn't have a word.
No, that is what is the task of doing philosophy. Because, suppose for example, he is giving this is a very nice simple example, that's why I'll give it. Being in the world, there is to be in the world. I'm a being in the world. Being in the world is something which you can write. Oh, this mic is a being in the world or something like that. Suppose I want to use that term. Now when I write it in English, it is I am a being in the world. Seems very simple, I can read it. But Heidegger has a problem. He writes it like this. Not this exact sentence, but just give it. He says, I am a being dash in dash the dash world. That is, he hyphenates being in the world as if it's one word. What does hyphenation do? It takes 4 words being in the world and creates it as one word being in the world. What does it do? Very importantly, it takes a sequence and makes it as simultaneous. It is not being in the world, it is being in the world. Why does he do it? Because he thinks it is not the case that the world is given to us and then we occupy the world. My being coexists with the world. So remember how simple thing like this is so profound implication in writing. When I write being in the world, being comes first, world comes later. World comes first, being comes later. Being is present in the world. There's a temporal sequence, right? So by hyphenating it, he is breaking the temporal sequence between being and world. And that they come together simultaneously, they occur together simultaneously and not as one priority over the other. That, you can read that and say, why is he doing this? And he's struggling with it. Because he doesn't have language to describe this philosophical puzzle. Because he doesn't think, because people can use other terms. For example, co-constitute. We co-constitute the world. Which means there is nothing called a world which is available before my existence. Therefore, I can't say, I came to the world, I inhabited the world, which might imply there was a world which I came and inhabited, because it's only my coming into existence that even creates the idea of this world that we see. And how do I capture that? I can either use a new term or I can work with language in this particular way. And that's what mathematics does. When it takes natural language terms, morphs it in a very different type of dynamism, like symbolic writing. Here, you are morphing those words, keeping them as they are, because and this is a great puzzle about mathematics, about philosophy. Why do they not use other symbolic systems? Why doesn't social science, it's a larger question of what kind of language systems I should use. But this is what they are trying to do. When he is saying this multiple as multiple of multiples, or the theory of the multiple without one, in a hyphenated form, again, you notice that. Because if you are a very attentive reader, you could have said, why didn't he just say theory of the multiple without one? What is the hyphenation doing here? And if you are a careful reader, we should ask that question. Either he's just done it because he said, put some hyphenate, looks nice, or there's a very good reason for him doing it. Maybe like the Heideggerian one, he's saying it is impossible to talk of multiple as if it is different from one. Because multiple and one are always present together. And the only way my language can capture that intuition is to say multiple without one as hyphenated. The only way I can talk about this phenomena is to say the multiple as multiple of multiples.
This theory of hyphenation is actually another use of it is in very good poetry. Yeats uses a lot of compounding.
Okay.
So he talks about a dolphin tone, gone tormented sea, dolphin tone,
Okay.
hyphen tone, gone tormented. So this idea of sort of hyphenating words in order to give metaphors, to provide metaphors, is also a lakshana of great poetry in every language.
Okay, so that's a very good addition to this. In the sense, what I'm trying to say is, a text is created of many things, not just the words, but the way in which words are put together, composed together, and other things. Okay, and so I'm saying, even the charity principle, you can actually read something of it, but it is also the case that I think a lot of these texts are also very self-indulgent. My only point about them is, many times they can be very self-indulgent. That is, they take themselves too seriously in what they say, and they don't think it is their task to be able to make it transparent, if you like, in some sense. But Badiou might also say, transparency is not my game. Philosophy is not transparent. Sorry, being is not transparent. There's nothing I can do about it. It's not I who want to be like this. It's just that being is not transparent. And there's no other way you can do multiple without one as that. And if you go and do mathematics, it is as obscurantist as this. Therefore, whatever, he might say that. But we have two questions on this.
I want to bring you back to the idea of ambiguity and in this.
Yeah.
You mentioned about Einstein trying to bring it very similar to scientific thing. So you brought Einstein, but there is no other way. Like you said, scientists have to bring the I from the text. So there's no other way there will be two possibilities. Either you will understand what Einstein is trying to say, or either you will not understand it at all. So there's no other way to understand it. That's what science do. Like,
no, why would you say there's no other way?
Like, in philosophical texts, there are like a lot of commentaries about it.
Yeah.
But in science, we try our best to bring only one meaning to what I'm trying to say.
Okay, so this is
This kind of objectivity we want in science. And I'm also critical about being reductionist, to understand it. But as Popper says, we have to bring, if we are trying to solve something, we have to bring it to a point
Correct.
where it is testable,
Yeah.
where it is away from me.
Yeah.
So if it's not testable, are we really able to find a solution to the problem?
Okay.
Or we are just trying to be, as you say, being ambiguous and leaving it to,
Okay.
So we have to balance this
Yeah.
whole problem.
Okay, very quick answer to that is that no, the testability question. Okay, so the answer to this is this, that there are many types of knowledge. Okay, and you have to ask the question, what is the nature of philosophical knowledge? I know what is the nature of scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is knowledge of the natural phenomena. That is a test of it. I don't need anything more. Does it give me knowledge of a natural phenomena? If it does, it is scientific knowledge. What is philosophical knowledge? It is not knowledge of the natural phenomena. That is, they are not trying to answer why the sky is blue.
But both are coming to something called as truth.
No, so I'll tell you
Idea
what.
of truth.
Yeah, but I'm saying that influences what method you need. If scientific knowledge is that which is the truth of natural phenomena, then it needs empirical testing, repeatability, all of that stuff, which you know. But if philosophical knowledge is not about truth of the phenomena, it is truth of our conceptual foundation. So let me explain this very quickly. That is, what knowledge a philosophical text is supposed to give you is not necessarily just about how to live our lives. There are some people mistake some philosophy as that. It is saying something more profound. It is talking about the very foundations of our knowledge system. It is asking questions, what makes knowledge possible? Not whether, so it's definitional and foundational. Those questions are not empirical. I'll give you again a very simple instance, you might see this. In science, I can test whether electron has negative. Let's say somebody says an electron has this negative -1 charge, whatever they mean. It's got some quantity, right? So let's call it as -1. So it's got a charge of -1. And let's say you do experiments, you test it, everybody tests it. I look at the theory and all that. But science does not ask the question, what is an electron? Or like my student Varun is now working on photons. The question he asks is, how is a photon? When he's asking that, what is he saying? Photon we know has got this some property. Everybody can measure it, or there are some theories for it. But how is it to be a photon? How is it to be an electron? And another example of understanding that is, you say electron has a mass. Again measured, repeated, etc. But what is the mass of an electron? We think if something has a mass, it's made up of something. It's made up of matter. So does the electron made up of matter? If electron is made up of matter, what is that matter? Would we ask that question? You don't find that question in science textbooks. You can take any physics book and you look at the nature of quantum theory and a very advanced book. Nobody is asking the question, what is that matter which makes an electron? Which you think maybe they can say, well, that's, so what scientists will say is, that's not our concern. If they ask that as their concern, then it is actually a philosophical question. And this is the way they escape out of it.
No, because they say it's a lepton fundamental.
No, that is, lepton is fundamental is okay. I'm talking about just the matter. Lepton is just a family classification. Mass, let's say it's got some units, some 10 to the power minus something, 30 something. Let's call it, let's say 1 gram. Let's say electron is 1 gram. Okay? I can do all the properties of it. But the question of, for example, the so-called philosophical question, that is the subject matter of philosophy. You say, well, what does it mean for an electron to exist? If you say it's made up of matter or mass, what is the nature of that mass? Is it like physical matter? If it is physical matter, what is it made up of? Can we ask that question? So what they do with the fundamental particle picture, whether the leptonic or otherwise, is to say this is the most fundamental, there is no further breakdown. But that's a hypothesis. That is not a philosophical question. For example, the fundamental hypothesis of theory of relativity, speed of light is constant. You can construct all theories, what happens if speed of light is greater, etc., etc. But the hypothesis that speed of light is constant can even be empirically tested. That's scientific knowledge. But to ask the question, how is it possible that the very concept of speed can have a limit like that? Because by definition, speed is that at which something is moving at some speed. And if I push it, it may go faster, etc. How is it that for light, I cannot think of it going faster than the speed of light? What is the basis I need to know to make sense of it? They are not even saying right or wrong. What is the conceptual tools I need to make sense of this claim? They are not interested if it's right or wrong. Philosophers are least interested if this is correct or right. Let's assume it's right. What is it? How is it that you can accept the idea of a concept of a speed and say that this is the maximum, it cannot go even 1.01 meter faster than that?
So it's questioning the underlying assumptions.
So that is the nature of philosophical knowledge, and that's not empirical, that's not repeatable. It is to ask our foundational assumptions. It's a questioning about our basic foundational assumptions. How does a concept come into being? What kind of meaning does it have? What do I do with that? So I will just illustrate it with a final example and we will end to that. Yeah.
Is it an emotional instigation? The structure of
No, I would say it's
structure of experience is actually feeling, thinking, knowing,
yeah.
and doing. So there is more of feelings and emotions involved.
In philosophy, you think? No, philosophers are normally seen to be very emotionless chaps. Except people like Badiou and others.
Like
yeah. No, I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying it as a joke. But, I think it's this constant struggle to know what is the foundation of your beliefs. That's all. So, philosophers very rarely I as a philosopher think if I want to look at a framework, I don't want to look at something and judge it for what it is. I want to go back and ask, how does that come into being? So, famous example, the Kantian, so-called the very important Kantian idea of philosophy is not what is this, what is that, but how is metaphysics possible? How is something like this possible? That's all. It may be something, let's say I see something in front of me which is like terrible. I can either say, it's a terrible thing. That's a judgment. But as a philosopher, I'm just saying, how is this such a thing possible in my cognition? So it is answering a completely different kind of a question. But we think that kind of a question is important even for the empirical sciences. And it's because Einstein very famously is supposed to have asked this question. He gives this thing that it seems when you're 16 years old, he's very popular Einstein, I think it's largely true. When you're 16 years old, he asked himself the question, what would it be like if I sat on a photon and went around the earth? Apparently that was the question which triggered much of his reflections later on. That question is not really an empirical question, it's not scientific knowledge. It can never be scientific knowledge because Einstein cannot sit on a photon and go around the world. And that's why he called it thought experiment and so on. But that kind of a fundamental questioning of our foundational belief systems, that really constitutes a major part of the philosophical enterprise. Badiou, when he's writing all this stuff, he is questioning our very idea of multiplicity. Why is it? What is multiple for me? He doesn't understand what is multiple. Because he said, I'm looking at all of you as one thing here. I want to make sense of that thing which I have. And I don't know how else to do that. Okay, I think you had a question in the back.
No, the question really was that if this is the fundamental formulation, why is it the burden of philosophers to be accessible to me?
Correct.
Unless I am invested in some way in going through this journey, why is it that why is it that we cast this burden that because you're speaking of life or of being or of how it is that I exist in the world, if those were broadly philosophical questions.
Yeah.
Unless I'm invested in discovering these things, why do they need to have any relevance, or why do they need to be accessible to a person who is not invested in discovering what this journey is?
Yeah. Okay. And I think you're actually asking a question of why this project at all. So in a sense, very important question. Correct. No, it's a very important, because that's, we can't hide behind some philosophical answer to that. So I have to give you a empirical, clear-cut answer, which is that, one of our simple answers to that is that, as I said, if you look at what our workshops for PhD students, etc., people, every discipline has a genesis in philosophical conceptualizations. So why would that matter? Because when people are using terms like, let's say, justice, inequality, etc., there is a particular formulation of it, and there are a particular set of assumptions which are taken up by us when we use those terms. Now, being completely ignorant of them is harmful to the way we use the terms today. And today, for example, in cultural terms, karma is so often it is iterated through TV, through people's making sense of their lives. Now, it has been very deeply a matter of philosophical discussion among various schools. So when one can ask the question, well, if you look at it from that particular, does it help you understand your usage of those terms better? So it's actually liberating in the sense. So I always think, for example, mathematics teaching is far more efficient and useful when children know some philosophy of mathematics. Not in terms of what we call as philosophy, like all this. Simple ideas, like we did this philosophy camp for children. It was so good, and all of us also enjoyed it so much, because it's actually about showing children the conceptual term they believe in, and we're just asking them, what is the source of your belief? Why do you say this about perception? We ask them, what do you think is to be good and what is it bad? And the whole session we just did on that. Not an hour, we didn't use any of these big terms. Just working with them on their own philosophical inherence they have. So, in a sense, we are already inherent completely. We are filled with various philosophical concepts which we use to talk about the world. We are only doing the task of strengthening our understanding of it. So we are saying, like supposedly Plato is supposed to have said, but the variation of that, an unreflected world. What is it? Unexamined life is not worth living. So we think philosophy is a way to give us tools for examination of our things. And that's why, and I think it has great effect, because for much of my pieces I write in Hindu are about, never uses the term philosophy in the sense or used in the metaphysics, epistemology, but it's always working with philosophical themes inherent in our everyday practices, whether it's a Sabrimala thing or about elections or even about reading or whatever it is. That's really, in a sense, the reason why I think this is useful. Okay, I'll just end finally with this last 1 minute slide, if I can operate this, just to show you how, just to make a final comment, that if you look at, people often say this about Indian philosophical texts, can we read Indian philosophical texts? I just want to end with a comment on that. Because, I've already taken care of that question earlier when I was talking about translation and philosophical texts. Very often people will say, there are these texts, unless you know Sanskrit, you can't read this, etc. And whether it's correctly translated, all these issues. The only point I want to make is, we don't say these kind of questions for other philosophical texts. We get this from Greek, we get this from German. Most of the philosophical texts we are reading are from Germans, French, and the Greek. And I don't think there are people there, maybe one or two people who are good in it, but that doesn't stop you from accessing that. So the point which I want to point out here is that many of these are largely about about ways of thinking about the world. So when I talk of Indian philosophical texts, of course, how do I read it? There are different strategies of reading it. I think the language is not as important as people sometimes make it out to be. And Indian philosophical texts in general are far more like analytical tradition. They are far more accessible. They are very clear. In fact, they are obsessed about defining every step. They are obsessed about making sure the terms they use are clearly understood by you before you use it. So there is very little of Badiou and Heidegger in those kinds of terms. if you look at Shankara, or even so why I'm saying Shankara is very often you see it as Vedantic traditions, are very strongly analytical in character, but there are very fundamental the subjects of discourse are often, some of them can be very similar, some of them can be different. For example, almost all Indian philosophical traditions invest very deeply in personal experience or description of experience rather than just category of experience. So, for example, just to give a quick example, if you see smoke and you may say, oh, there is fire, the Indian philosophers would be, they are almost like Gandhi in the sense, insistence on this minute thing. So they will say, when I see fire, when I see smoke, I am not inferring fire, which is what we normally talk about it in the thing, but they will say, I have an experiential cognition that there is fire in that place. So in other words, to give you a more simpler example, suppose I say the apple is sweet, okay, we know, all of us think we know what it means, but for Indian philosophers, the description of that would not be apple is sweet, there will be apple, there is a cognitive state corresponding to the apple being sweet. In other words, it is like saying apple is sweet for me. To rephrase that, to emphasize a point, it's only about my experience I'm talking about. Or you would say, you will not say apple is sweet, you would say I have an experience of sweetness of apple. And that's, it's a very tiring to write like that. But that's the only form of thing. But the philosophical textual traditions are quite similar in many of them. Although much more like the analytical tradition than the continental tradition. And one of the great texts, for example, which I said, if any of you will do, Nagarjuna's Moolamati Vikarika, I'm saying this because a part of this series of talks is also to have reading groups for people who want to work with specific texts. And so there are many different texts, whether it's Badyu to Nagarjuna or Nyaya or whatever, philosophy of science or technology. There's a lot of very interesting material in philosophy of technology these days. So we just were hoping that if people are interested, they can have reading groups to work on specific texts together and so on. So all this is just to give you a very broad introduction to motivate you to think through some of these questions of philosophical texts, how to read them, how to approach them, and how to actually work within our own disciplinary practices on these philosophical ideas, because you cannot escape engaging with these kinds of questions in whichever discipline you work in. And that's why I think part of it is what they were saying is that they would also be willing to do these workshops and reading groups in different institutes wherever people are, so it makes it easier also and stuff like that. So I'm sorry I took a few more minutes than what I thought, but maybe we'll wind up in the last.
Yeah, and one last thing. Since being was talked about, and in keeping with the idea of Barefoot Philosophers and their project to go beyond regular philosophy texts and all of that, I think one of the most wonderful examinations of, say, being is in Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes. Hobbes' state of alive and vibrant to Calvin and as a stuffed toy to his parents is really a matter of being. Really. It's really all through the text it sort of continues that examination, and it's never resolved. But it sort of provides.
That's very. In fact, a lot of good comics are very deeply philosophical, and that's the whole point about. Okay, the final point I want to say, therefore, is that the commentary tradition which people talked about, like in commentary is a very central core of philosophical thinking, and like somebody you were saying about in science, right? Science it's not fixed at all. There are very good studies in history of science which will show you that a paper which is written now, for example, even if it's Einstein's paper, it gets picked up and rewritten in different ways for the next 50 years. In fact, the beauty of that is what Einstein thought of as relativity, either in 1905 or 1919, 1920, is not what it is now. The growth of it, there may be some central points you may have retained, like the famous so-called E equal MC squared, but some basic structures are retained. But the discipline the work drawing on it has grown so much. We should look upon a lot of researchers' commentaries on Einstein's theory. That's all. Because Einstein would say, given this, let's say one of the examples of, one model of the universe was like this. Then somebody who modifies that and says, no, if I remove this assumption, what could it be? That's a new research paper, right? That's commentary tradition. In fact, in Indian philosophical tradition, there are so many commentary traditions. You know, you will first have these sutras, which are like the short ones which you saw briefly, and then you have the bhashyas on it, then you will have a series. I mean, I was just written a very quick round of it somewhere. You have bhashyas, vartikas, then nibandhas, which do a particular kind of things, and there are karikas, etc., etc. I mean, there's quite a lot of... So these are all commentary traditions which are doing something to certain statements which are done. And that's really, I mean, research is actually a lot of commentary tradition. You know, except when people make new work like Einstein's or something. But once that is done, everything, we are all commentators. Drawing, small, making, they'll also say, change this word, what will be the meaning of this sentence? You change one assumption there, what is the new model you get? So that's a very important part of what it means to, and I would say the commentary tradition is necessary because of this one simple fundamental philosophical truth which I'll end with. Language, no language is enough to complete the ultimate reality of the world. No language. It can be the greatest mind and the greatest language, no language. Even mathematics needs English to support it. English or natural language. Without it you can't have mathematics. If I just write F equal to ma, you don't know what to do with it. I first have to tell you, let F be force. Let M, then I know what it means. So it's a very important, simple philosophical truth is this. No language that we have has the power to match the richness of the reality around us. So our constant attempt is to keep building more languages, translating, mixing, trying, it's all experiment with language. That's why I was trying to say even philosophy is as much experiment with language as it is with the world or ideas and so on. You know, that's why a central core principle of the continental thought, famously made by Derrida, is there is nothing outside language. He said there is nothing outside text, but basically there is nothing outside language. Language is the ultimate reality, and we are constantly searching and searching and searching for it, and texts are one illustration of that. Okay, thank you so much.